She opened her diner every morning before the sun rose. Same hands that once held a badge, now pouring coffee for strangers who never looked her in the eye. To most, she was just another black woman running a small-town diner at the edge of nowhere. But behind that quiet smile was a story she never told, one that could silence an entire room if anyone dared to hear it. It was supposed to be just another day. The scent of bacon, the clatter of plates, and the soft hum of an old jukebox. But that morning, the door didn't just open for customers. It opened for chaos. 4 men walked in, loud, entitled, wearing arrogance like armor. Their laughter cut through the air sharper than any knife in her kitchen. They weren't there for breakfast. They were there to make a point, one soaked in hate and ignorance. At first, the room froze. Locals looked away, pretending not to see, because in this town, silence was survival. But she didn't look away. She stood there, calm, still, unshaken, as if she had seen monsters far worse than them before. They thought they had power. They thought fear would follow their shadows. But what they didn't know was who they were standing in front of. Because the woman they tried to humiliate once brought down men like them for a living. And this time she wasn't just serving breakfast. She was serving justice. That morning, the world would learn what happens when hate meets the wrong woman. This is the story of the diner no one dared to enter again. The day a gang tried to break her, and instead uncovered the truth that left them trembling. Who was she really? And what did she do? When their laughter stopped, the sun always rose the same way over Ridgefield, quiet, golden, and slow. The kind of morning that made you believe the world could still be kind. For Marcia Ellis, that first light meant one thing: time to open the diner. She'd owned it for 7 years, ever since her husband passed away. It wasn't much, just 6 red stools, a handful of tables, and a flickering neon sign that read, Marcia's Place. But for the tired truckers, lonely travelers, and old-timers who came in for coffee, it was warmth. It was safety. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything. The way a customer stirred their cup too long meant they had something heavy on their mind. A half-finished breakfast meant bad news waiting at home. But no one ever noticed her. They just saw the apron, the skin color, the quiet smile, not the steel that lived behind her eyes. Ridgefield wasn't a place where people said things out loud. Racism lived in whispers here, in the way eyes shifted when she walked into the grocery store, in the way kids asked their parents why the diner lady had different skin. But Marcia never fought back. Not because she was weak, but because she understood the power of patience. She'd seen how hate consumed people. She'd seen it break lives. Behind the counter, a small photo sat near the register. A younger Marcia in a crisp suit, standing beside an American flag. Most thought it was her late husband's picture. No one asked, and she never corrected them. Some truths were safer hidden. Her life ran like clockwork. Dawn coffee, mid-morning rush, quiet afternoons, predictable, peaceful, until one day, that peace cracked. Not with an earthquake, but with footsteps. Heavy, careless, and cruel. It started with laughter outside. Then the diner door swung open. 4 strangers. Tattoos, leather, and trouble written all over their faces. The kind of men who fed on fear. Marcia looked up, her hand still on the coffee pot. She didn't flinch. Not even a heartbeat, because deep down she knew. This wasn't just another customer. This was the day her past would finally come knocking. The first laugh was shallow and performative, the kind of sound used to claim territory. It slid across the counter, bounced off the chrome, and settled on Marcia's shoulders like a dare. She kept her rhythm anyway, cup, saucer, pour, pretending not to notice the way the air changed. The regulars pretended too. Forks lifted and fell without tasting. Newspapers stayed open on the same paragraph. Fear rehearsed its oldest trick. Act normal and danger might pass you by. It didn't pass. The strangers moved with a swagger that announced a script they had performed many times. They leaned where they wanted, stood where they shouldn't, and let their presence swell until the diner felt 2 sizes too small. Their eyes traveled over everything like inventory. The register, the back door, the lone security camera pointed the wrong way. They wore their tattoos like warnings and their silence like a threat. In a town that measured decency with quiet routines, this was a storm kicking open the door. Marcia set down the pot. She had the steady hands of someone who didn't fight fire with panic. The room waited to see what would happen to her. It had always been that way here. People watched from a safe, invisible distance, as if other people's pain were a television show that you could turn off by blinking. The first insult wasn't a word. It was a look, lingering, demeaning, heavy with the false comfort of superiority. It lingered on her skin like grease. The second insult was the invasion of space, a deliberate step too close followed by another, the kind meant to test a boundary with a grin that said no one would stop them. The third insult was a casual brush against the photo by the register, a finger smearing across the glass, a mocking pause at the crisp suit and the flag. The photo returned the stare in perfect silence. She reached for a towel and wiped the counter she had already cleaned. The gesture was habitual and practical, and also something else, cover for the way her eyes counted. 4 strangers. 12 customers. 1 back exit. 2 knives in the kitchen within arm's reach. The soft whir in the wall from a sensor no one else knew was there. The knowledge settled over her like a coat she used to wear every day, and then hung up. The harassment began like a game played for the benefit of an audience that wanted no part of it. The men performed exaggerations of impatience and disbelief. They claimed seats without asking and space without permission. They reached past other people's plates. They knocked a spoon to the floor and stared at it as if the metal itself had made a mistake. Marcia bent to pick it up with a calm that enraged them because it didn't feed what they had come to eat. A scrape echoed, the metal leg of a chair dragged out of place. Then another. The regulars found excuses to leave that sounded like clumsy apologies inside their own heads. A cough. A glance at a wristwatch that no longer worked. A bill left under a cup with too much cash for what had been consumed. The door chimed once, twice, 3 times. The room emptied around Marcia with the slow inevitability of a tide going out, revealing how much wreckage had been hiding underwater. This was how cruelty liked to work in places like Ridgefield. Not with spectacle at first, but with erosion. Erode dignity, erode safety, erode witnesses. What remained then was an isolated target and a stage. Marcia had never needed an audience. She moved through her checklist with the quiet efficiency of muscle memory. Refill decanter. Lock register. Reset the jukebox when the song skipped. Tuck stray hair behind her ear. None of it mattered to the men. They rose and fell on the same rhythm of provocation and pause, pushing until they grew bored and then retreating for a new angle. They blocked the aisle to the kitchen. They repositioned themselves between her and the phone. They tested the camera with a subtle hand across the lens as if by accident. They were setting a perimeter without calling it that. Outside, the town continued as if nothing had changed. Trucks rolled by. A siren wailed somewhere far off and then faded. The sun eased up above the rooftops with steady indifference. Inside, time folded in on itself, the diner becoming smaller with each breath. The first spill was staged. A cup tilted. Coffee spread like a stain blooming in a time lapse. Sugar packets fell in slow motion. The mess asked for humiliation, the kind that makes a person bend while others watch. Instead, Marcia fetched the mop and handled it with the same dignity she handled everything. Dignity, however, wasn't the currency the men came to collect. They were after submission. They were after an apology that admitted to an inferior station. They were after fear. They didn't find any on her face, and that made everything worse. Word travels strangely in small towns. A minute later, a man from the hardware store paused outside the window and then kept walking. 2 high schoolers on bikes slowed, saw the men, and sped up. The mail carrier glanced at the neon sign that flickered between letters and made note of it for no reason he could articulate. Even people who refused to look were looking. Even people who claimed not to hear recognized the frequency of trouble humming against the glass. That was when the cruiser slid to the curb. It wasn't there to help. Marcia read the posture before the door opened. The leisurely angle, the bored expression, the hand at the belt. The deputy stepped inside with a familiarity that didn't include her name. His eyes traveled the room, found the men, and then found Marcia as if measuring which way the wind was blowing. He wore the badge like armor and indifference, like a second skin. The room got even smaller. He stayed long enough to signal something to the men without a word. Then he left, a departure that said more than his presence had. The door chime rang cheerful and false. Outside, he leaned on the hood of the cruiser and looked at his phone while being watched by the reflections in the diner windows. The message was simple. Whatever happened in here was on its own. Marcia's heartbeat slowed instead of rising. Isolation had always been more clarifying than company. They wanted her to react. She did not. They wanted a crack in her voice, a falter in the hand. She gave them steadiness and the same exact pour for every cup they demanded without paying. It was a performance of patience that came from a different life. The men grew bolder. One disappeared for a few minutes and came back smelling like gasoline. Another traced his finger over the edge of the counter, as if testing for weakness in the wood. They shifted their weight so the floorboards spoke in long, complaining groans. Each action carried an implied future. A fire that wouldn't quite catch, a broken thing that would be blamed on her, a noise at midnight that no one would claim to have heard. Their cruelty was a promise disguised as a joke. By noon, the diner was empty except for them. The regulars had invented reasons to stay away for the rest of the day. Texts were sent that asked nothing and said everything. People who had known Marcia's smile for years convinced themselves that staying uninvolved was the same thing as staying humane. The town passed the test by failing it quietly. Afternoon settled in with an unseasonal heat. The air conditioning coughed once and fell behind. Sweat formed at the temple and jawline. The men lounged like house cats, lazy and ready, conserving energy for whatever came next. They had turned her business into their waiting room, waiting for what was a question that pressed against the glass. The answer arrived in pieces. The first piece was a sticker appearing overnight. On her back alley dumpster, a black and white emblem no one admitted knowing. A symbol that could be dismissed as nothing to people who wanted to sleep well. The second piece was a review posted under a fake name, claiming her food made a child sick. The third was a license inspection request with a time stamped precisely at her busiest hour, accompanied by a note citing anonymous complaints. None of these on their own meant anything. Together, they were choreography. The fourth piece was a dead bird on the back steps, arranged just so. Even cruelty liked theatrics. Marcia documented everything. She saved the review, time-stamped the inspection request, photographed the dumpster sticker, recorded the steps of a day that had become a pattern. She did it the same way she did everything, quietly, precisely, without asking permission. In the evening, she sat at the far booth that caught the last warm light and filled a small notebook with columns that would have looked like grocery lists to anyone else. The cover bore a faint impression of letters pressed so many times that the surface held them even when the ink hid. The words were simple. The system they belonged to was not. At midnight, a truck idled behind the diner long enough to make the windows tremble. It left without incident and returned at 2 a.m. The second time, it cut its lights. The third time, it backed into the alley as if rehearsing a delivery. The fourth time, it did nothing at all. Silence can be louder than any engine if it is repeated with intent. Morning came with the smell of smoke that had no visible source. Ash drifted from somewhere a block over, a warning written in the most ancient language of fear. The gang returned with a new configuration. One face replaced by a larger one, a man whose movements were small and contained in a way that suggested he wanted witnesses only when it benefited him. The others deferred without knowing they were doing it. Deference recognizes itself across the room and bows without being asked. Patrons trickled in, saw the men, and performed the tiny math of risk that decided whether this was a day they could afford a confrontation. It rarely was. The air filled with the metallic taste of restraint. Marcia continued to move at the pace she chose rather than the pace imposed on her. She had learned long ago that time is a weapon when properly tempered. That afternoon brought the sheriff himself. He made a show of glancing around and left a business card on the counter that didn't include a personal cell number. His eyes slid over the men as if they were part of the decor, as ordinary as salt shakers. He told her nothing in a way that said everything. The card remained where it landed until she placed it under the register drawer with the other artifacts of abdication. The escalation sharpened. A delivery was misplaced. A supplier changed terms without warning. A complaint appeared from a neighbor who didn't exist. The jukebox cut out for no reason. When it returned, it repeated the same song on a loop that turned its nostalgia into a taunt. Her trash disappeared one night and reappeared in a heap on the sidewalk 2 doors down. Petty sabotage warmed up for larger cruelty like a band tuning instruments before the main performance. Marcia adjusted. She turned cameras inward as well as outward. She repositioned mirrors so reflections granted her eyes in places her body did not reach. She moved money differently, counted inventory at irregular intervals, shifted her start time by 15 minutes without altering the appearance of routine. She took old habits off the shelf and put them on like a second skin. The diner felt less like a small business, and more like a chessboard she knew better than any opponent. Then came the night of the storm. Lightning stitched the sky, while rain lashed the windows with a fury that made the neon sign buzz in pain. Power flickered. The streets emptied. Storms are friends to people who want to be unseen. At closing, a lone car idled across the street with wipers set too slow for the downpour. Headlights cut through sheets of water to draw shapes on the wall that looked like bars of a cell. The car remained after she locked up, left with her and turned 1 block too many in the same direction to be an accident. When she parked in her driveway, the car rolled past without stopping, the driver's face lit only by the pale glow of a dashboard that revealed nothing. The next morning, someone had keyed a single word into the paint of her back door. The letters were crude and deliberate. Rage tried to rise in her chest. She did not let it. Rage is a luxury. Precision is cheaper and costs less later. She cleaned the door, recorded the damage, and reopened on time. News traveled faster now. More men began to drift in on staggered schedules, an echo of the original 4 until the diner felt like a mouth collecting teeth. Some came alone to scout. Some arrived in 2s and 3s to test reactions. They cared less about food than about territory. They carved their names not into wood, but into the way other people behaved. In their wake, quiet regulars disappeared for longer stretches. The booths by the window went empty. The tips grew smaller except for those left by people overcompensating for the shame of coming when the coast was clear. A mother with a toddler stopped coming at all. An elderly couple switched to takeout and sent their grandson to pick it up. People who claimed to love the diner loved it most from the safety of their living rooms. One evening, close to closing, a man sat where the camera couldn't quite see. He watched her with a patience that did not match the rest. He left behind a folded napkin weighted by a quarter. Under the coin, a symbol appeared. Cleaner than the sticker on the dumpster, crisp and confident, stamped rather than drawn. It belonged to a network that preferred its messages to look like nothing at all. Her stomach pulled tight. She understood the caliber of the storm she stood inside. This wasn't only about humiliation. It was about recruitment, territory, money moving quietly through hands that paid cash and asked no questions. It was about teaching a lesson that would travel farther than one diner. She changed her opening routine the next day and the next. She left the lights off longer. She opened 1 blind instead of 3. She watched the reflection of the front door in the polished steel of the milkshake canister. She moved the photograph by the register 2 inches to the left, a tell to herself that doubled as bait for anyone who had already touched it once. No one seemed to notice. The people who notice small movements are not the ones who rely on intimidation to survive. Still, they noticed something. Pressure increased. A bottle shattered in the alley at dawn and skittered glass under the back door. A burning smell followed, but no flame. A note appeared torn from a yellow pad with a line so ordinary it would have sounded harmless to anyone who didn't know what it meant. She knew. It meant the circle was closing and the game was ending. It meant soon. Marcia collected her notebook from the far booth and smoothed the pages. She made 3 calls that didn't look like calls. She sent 2 messages that didn't look like messages. Then she made coffee as if nothing in the world required urgency. The first regular walked in at 6:10 and paused, sensing the temperature had changed in a way that a thermostat couldn't measure. The gang arrived at 6:12. They came with numbers that made the diner feel airless. They filled the booths, the stools, the doorway. They didn't bother hiding. Whatever they wanted would be done in the open, because power prefers an audience when it is sure it won't be interrupted. They spread out with confidence that told her more than the number of bodies could. Somewhere nearby, a phone would be recording for evidence that would never be used. Somewhere else, an eye would be watching to see how far things could go without drawing consequences. The deputy's cruiser rolled by slowly and did not slow enough to stop. It passed like an exhale. On another block, the sheriff sat in a parked SUV and looked at a screen, his face lit in blue and still. Neighborhood doors stayed shut. Shades stayed drawn. People decided that minding their business was an honorable tradition on mornings like this. The diner's neon sign flickered as if trying to answer a question no one had asked aloud. Marcia moved with purpose between coffee and griddle and register. Beneath the apron, her posture changed by 1 degree, the kind that would not register to anyone who hadn't studied posture the way soldiers study maps. She glanced once at the photograph, once at the clock, and once at the tall man who had replaced one of the originals. His eyes carried calculation and contempt in equal measure. He set his hands on the counter with ownership. His knuckles were scarred. His wrists bore faint marks of metal that had been too tight for too long. He wanted to make a point that would build his legend. She suspected he had built many points in places like this, in towns where a woman like her was an easy stand-in for every stereotype his life required. He was not prepared for a person who had refused to live inside anyone else's story. Lunch hour approached with the slowness of a held breath. A tourist couple pushed the door open, felt the atmosphere, and left without pretending to need a restroom. A delivery driver carried in a box, saw the crowd, and backed out with an apology mouthed rather than spoken. A bus rumbled by and kicked up grit that settled on the windows like dust on a portrait. At 12:03, the power blinked. It came back on after a heartbeat. Too quickly for a citywide outage, too precisely to be weather. The men exchanged the kind of laugh that feeds on intimidation. The jukebox restarted at the beginning of the same song. The neon sign steadied. The air conditioner hummed back into life in a pitch that felt an octave lower. Someone had tested something. Someone wanted her to know. Marcia's eyes moved right, then left, then down to the floor where a patch of water had appeared without a glass to cause it. The ceiling didn't leak. The water was not water. The smell was too sharp. She registered the thread of danger stretching beneath the linoleum toward the back and calculated how long it would take for fire to find air given the weather and the angles of the room. She registered how many seconds she would have to move each person if she were alone. She was not alone. A man at the far end of the counter unfolded the newspaper he had been pretending to read. His shoes were too sensible for this town. His nails were too clean. He returned the paper to the counter, stood, and left exact change with a tip that was neither stingy nor generous. On the way out, he caught his sleeve on the coat hook near the door and muttered an apology only she could hear if she had allowed any words to enter her mind. He pushed the door open and let in a wind that carried the smell of rain from a storm that wasn't due until evening. The wind was a message. It told her what she needed to know. The circle around this diner was no longer just a circle of men. The minutes stretched, tight as wire. The tall man rose. He adjusted his jacket in a way that telegraphed metal without revealing it. He stepped into her space with entitlement that had become a habit. Time slowed enough for memory to return with too much clarity. Another room, another man, another set of eyes that had looked at her like she was an obstacle rather than a person. In that room, she had taken away his certainty and then his freedom. She had filed the paperwork that stitched his name to his actions. She had learned that paperwork could be a weapon if you wield it with precision and patience and a refusal to be rushed. She did not flinch. She did not step back. She did not become the version of herself these men required for their story to work. A small sound broke the moment. The soft click that comes when a switch meant to be hidden is pressed by a shoe. It was impossible to hear from more than 2 feet away. It traveled anyway, not to the men but to the people who knew how to listen for it. Somewhere a circuit closed. Somewhere else, A message left the building on a channel that had not alerted once in 7 years. Above the door, the neon sign flickered between letters and then steadied as if relieved. Outside, 2 cars parked with precision that read as chance to anyone not trained to read it properly. Across the street, a woman pretended to struggle with groceries she could have carried easily and paused to adjust her bag in a way that kept her line of sight clean. The deputy's cruiser reappeared and rolled past again, slower this time, collecting details it would report to the wrong person. The sheriff's SUV turned a corner and disappeared entirely, confirming what needed confirmation. The tall man leaned in, his shadow falling across the photograph by the register. The frame caught the light and threw it back into his eyes for half a second. It was enough to force a blink. He placed his palm on the counter like a stamp on a document meant to finalize a deal. He had decided on the shape of this afternoon, and the shape looked like surrender disguised as courtesy, humiliation disguised as compliance, victory disguised as order. He had misread the paperwork. Behind the counter, below waist height, the toe of Marcia's shoe slid 1 inch to the left and found a plate of steel that felt exactly like memory. A pulse in the floor answered from deep under the booths where gum had collected for a decade. In the kitchen, a light the color of winter blinked twice above the back door that stuck in summer. The mirror above the coffee station angled another degree and captured reflections that a casual viewer would never track. In the far booth, her notebook lay open to a page that could have been a grocery list and was not. The men were still talking with their bodies, still claiming the room with presence and breath, when the door opened and the air changed again, not with the heat of intimidation, but with the cool certainty of people who knew the end of a story before the protagonist did. The first newcomer was ordinary on purpose. The second was even more ordinary. The third wore a jacket too light for the weather and shoes that made no sound on tile. They spread out with the practiced casualness of people who have made a career out of not being noticed until the exact moment they are. They didn't order. They didn't look at the menu. They didn't need to. Marcia's pulse found a steady drumbeat that matched an old rhythm. The tall man did not recognize the shift because his life had never required him to sense danger when he believed he owned the room. The jukebox clicked. The song changed for the first time in days. The tall man turned his head, irritated by a machine acting with a will. In the fraction of a moment when his attention slipped, the mirror captured the angle of his jacket, lifting to reveal the outline everyone in the room had pretended not to see. The outline was now recorded from 2 directions by devices hidden in places no gang of bored men would examine. Outside, a truck parked across 2 spaces and started a delivery that had not been scheduled. Inside, 2 of the newcomers reached for their napkins and wiped at a spot on the table that wasn't there, their wrists moving in a tempo older than the diner. The gang hadn't come only to frighten her. They had come to send a message to a town, to test how far impunity could walk before it tripped. They had come to finalize something larger than a harassment campaign. Cash, product, influence. These things like to move in daylight when they are sure daylight belongs to them. They did not know whose daylight this was. Somewhere beneath the counters, a quiet relay shut one circuit and opened another. The phone line split in 2 and traveled in directions that a utility map would not show. A signal left the diner and took routes that respected no county lines. In a basement 3 states away, a screen brightened. In a downtown office no one could find without an appointment. A small icon turned from gray to green and began to pulse. The tall man leaned even closer, past the photograph, past the years in her eyes, into a space where people imagine they can take something non-physical and keep it. He wanted her fear. He wanted it bottled and labeled with his name so he could sip it when needed. He reached for it without knowing it wasn't on the shelf where he thought it was kept. Marcia straightened, every inch of height mattering in a way that had nothing to do with inches. She had played this scene in rooms with worse lighting and better cameras. She had logged evidence in a voice that never shook. She had taught juries to see what they didn't want to see, and taught judges to read between lines that had been written to be unreadable. She had done all of it wearing a face that looked like a face people underestimate. He underestimated it now. The door opened again. The air pressure shifted. The woman with groceries across the street set down her bags and stood up taller. The deputy's cruiser paused at the corner and pretended to be stalled. The sheriff's SUV remained absent, a choice that would later be described as a scheduling conflict in a meeting that would not be recorded. The neon sign steadied to full brightness and held, as if the electricity itself had decided to stop negotiating. A siren sounded far away and then cut off mid-wail. Silence fell so completely that the drip from the coffee machine sounded like a clock ticking down. Marcia placed her hand on the counter in the exact place the tall man had stamped his earlier. Her fingers rested against the wood with the familiarity of someone touching the threshold of her own home. In the glass reflection of the photograph, a badge flashed for half a heartbeat, not enough for the men to register, more than enough for those who were meant to see. Not just any badge, the kind designed to end arguments. The tall man blinked, confused by a feeling he did not recognize. It wasn't fear yet. It was the precursor to fear. The sense that the story he thought he was in had changed genres without his consent. The light above the back door turned from winter to ice. Outside, the delivery truck's back roll-up door slid open to reveal boxes that were not labeled and hands that knew how to open them. Across the street, the woman with groceries touched her ear, and then her sleeve, and then nothing at all. The newcomers inside finished wiping their tables and set their napkins down exactly, corners aligned, fingers steady. The floor vibrated subtly, the way it does when heavy boots move in unison on pavement. The sound was swallowed by the walls and returned as certainty. The mirrors offered back every angle that mattered. The room shrank and then expanded, boundaries redrawn by people who had never once raised their voices to make a point. The tall man finally felt it. Not fear, recognition. He turned toward the door at the same instant that it swung wider to admit a shadow that blocked the light. The shadow carried authority that did not ask permission to exist. It moved with the quiet that belongs only to people who are sure of backing. The men who had arrived with laughter sat up straighter. Their smiles faltered. Their knuckles whitened. Marcia breathed once, deep and slow, and let the air fill every space inside her that had been empty since the first laugh. Behind the counter, beneath the apron, the fabric brushed against a surface that had not been touched in 7 years. It rested there, familiar as a heartbeat. The shadow stepped fully into the diner. Everything that had been promised by whispers and glances and calculated negligence was about to meet the one thing it could not survive: the truth of who she really was. And as the door swung shut on a room suddenly too bright for lies, the alarm that no one could hear reached the only ears that mattered. The diner felt like a heartbeat caught mid-pulse. Every sound, the hiss of the coffee pot, the scrape of a chair, the drip from the faucet, hung in the air as if afraid to move first. The gang had filled the space completely now, bodies blocking exits, shadows pressing in on glass. But something had changed. The woman they thought was cornered was no longer prey. She was assessing angles, reading faces, counting breaths. The tall man stepped closer, the one who believed control was his birthright. His hand brushed the counter as if testing ownership. He leaned in, close enough for her to smell the stale smoke and arrogance. His smirk said, "This is my world." Then the door swung open. The sound cracked through the tension like a gunshot. 3 figures entered, ordinary clothes, ordinary faces, but the air bent around them. Their eyes didn't wander. They didn't order coffee. They looked straight at her, and for the first time that day, Marcia allowed herself a single exhale. The tall man noticed it too. His smirk twitched. "Friends of yours?" He sneered, unaware that he had just spoken the final line of his own arrogance. The figures took their positions with surgical precision, one by the door, one by the window, one near the jukebox. Their movements were quiet, synchronized. The diner's hum changed pitch. The neon sign flickered once and then steadied, glowing brighter as though it too understood what was happening. Then came the sound, faint, deliberate, metallic. A latch, a click, a memory resurrected. The leader's hand froze mid-gesture as Marcia's fingers slid beneath the counter. What he thought was a cash drawer was something far older. She lifted her eyes, and the calm in them was no longer that of a waitress. It was the stillness of someone trained to move only when certainty demanded it. The next few seconds stretched thin. One of the men shifted, hand grazing the edge of his belt where metal glinted. Instantly, the diner erupted in motion. Chairs clattered, a plate shattered, a voice shouted, "Federal agents! Hands where I can see them!" Everything the gang thought they knew dissolved. The tall man's hand went to his jacket. But before arrogance could translate into action, he found himself staring down the barrel of a truth he couldn't rewrite. The woman he had cornered wasn't a waitress. She was the one who had built the files that put men like him behind bars. The badge beneath her apron was not a relic. It was current, valid, and shining with authority he couldn't corrupt. Marcia's voice was steady, cold iron after years of silence. "You thought this was your playground. You forgot who cleans up after the monsters." The leader tried to laugh, but it broke halfway through, collapsing into a tremor that betrayed him. Outside, black SUVs appeared like shadows coalescing from the rain. Tires screeched. Doors opened. Agents poured in, moving with practiced efficiency. The town that had watched in silence was suddenly surrounded by a justice it hadn't expected to witness. The gang's faces drained of color. One tried to run but found the doorway blocked by a figure twice his size. Another dropped to his knees, the weight of years of hate finally catching up to him. The tall man stayed frozen, pride the last brittle piece of armor he had left. Marcia stepped around the counter, every movement deliberate. She stopped in front of him, inches away, her eyes unblinking. "All this time," she said softly, "you thought fear was power. But fear only rules those who believe in it." The man's mouth opened, maybe to speak, maybe to curse, but the words never came. Hands pulled him back, metal snapped around his wrists, and the sound of the cuffs echoed like thunder through the diner. Outside, the rain began to fall harder. Blue and red lights painted the wet pavement in ghostly colors. Locals peered from behind curtains, faces pale with disbelief. For years they had looked away, convinced that silence kept them safe. Now they saw how silence had built this very moment, until one woman decided not to bend anymore. As the agents led the men out, one paused near the counter. He looked at the old photograph still sitting by the register, the one everyone had mistaken for her husband. Now they could see the truth. The younger version of Marcia in that picture wore the same badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. She hadn't left her post. She had simply taken her mission underground, the tall man shouted as he was pushed into the van, anger drowning in rain. "You'll never change this town. You think locking me up fixes anything?" Marcia watched him go, eyes unwavering. "No," she murmured, "but it's a start." The door closed behind them, and for the first time in months, the diner was silent. Not the silence of fear, but of release. Coffee steamed. The neon sign steadied. Somewhere, a clock ticked back into rhythm, but the town's quiet was temporary. Sirens faded, yet their echo lingered in the air like judgment. The sheriff who hadn't come was already packing excuses. The deputy who had looked away rehearsed his alibi. People would gather tomorrow, pretending they had always been on the right side. They would call her brave without understanding what bravery costs. Marcia returned to her counter. She set the badge down beside the photo, two versions of the same truth side by side. Her hands trembled once, just once, then steadied. She poured a fresh cup of coffee, placed it before an empty stool, and stared at the door that had finally stopped swinging. The storm outside began to ease. But in her chest, another storm still raged, the kind that doesn't destroy, but cleanses. Because this wasn't just about one diner, one woman, or one gang. It was about every place where silence had been mistaken for peace. It was about every person who had looked away and every woman who had been underestimated. And though the sirens were fading, she knew the real noise was only beginning, the conversations, the investigations, the reckoning. When the last light flickered off, Marcia looked out through the rain-streaked window at her reflection. Tired, scarred, unbroken, the diner was safe again. But the question remained, echoing in her mind and in the hearts of those who would soon hear her story. How many more women like her are still fighting in silence, waiting for the world to notice? The sirens were long gone, but their echo lived in the walls. The next morning, Marcia's diner stood as if nothing had happened. Same red stools, same cracked linoleum, same soft hum of the refrigerator. But something in the air had changed, something invisible yet undeniable. Fear no longer owned the place. It had been evicted. The news broke before sunrise. Federal agent exposes white supremacist network operating through local gang, the headlines read. Ridgefield, a town that had prided itself on quiet ignorance, suddenly became a headline itself. Reporters flooded in, pretending to care about community healing. But for the people who had watched everything unfold from behind their curtains, it wasn't healing they feared. It was exposure. The diner became a place of pilgrimage overnight. Cameras flashed against its windows. Curious strangers came not for coffee, but for stories. Some wanted to congratulate her, others wanted to study her, like courage was something you could analyze and bottle. Marcia served them all the same way she always had, calm, precise, and polite. But inside, she felt hollow, because courage doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like exhaustion. She hadn't wanted fame. She hadn't wanted attention. She just wanted to run her diner without being reminded that her skin came with a target. But now, her name was everywhere. On TV, in papers, online. The woman who fought back. The woman who exposed them. The woman who made the town look in the mirror. At night, when the cameras were gone, she sat by the same window and watched the rain fall. She thought about the years she spent blending in, the quiet survival that looked like peace, but was really just fatigue. She thought about every time she'd smiled through insult, every moment she'd chosen silence to keep the peace, and how silence had almost cost her everything. And she thought about them, the 4 men, now locked away, their faces stripped of swagger, replaced by fear. They would stand trial, but the verdict wouldn't erase the damage. Their hate was a symptom of something much older, something passed down like an heirloom. They were born into a sickness this country still refused to cure. The sheriff resigned 3 days later. The deputy disappeared from town altogether. People who once ignored her now stumbled over apologies they didn't really mean. We didn't know, they said. We had no idea it was that bad. But she knew they had known. They had just chosen comfort over courage. That was the real crime in Ridgefield. Not hatred, but the silence that fed it. Weeks passed. The diner reopened under the same neon sign, but with new energy. People started coming back, not out of pity, but respect. Truckers left bigger tips. Old regulars returned with awkward smiles that tried to say, "We see you now." And every so often, a young woman, usually black, sometimes Latina, would come in, order a coffee, and stay longer than necessary. Not to talk, just to sit near her, to see what strength looked like in person. Marcia never turned them away. She'd refill their cups, ask nothing, and offer everything through the quiet safety of her presence. Because she understood something now. Survival was not enough. Visibility was power. One night, she took the photo from beside the register and the one where she stood in her crisp federal uniform and hung it on the wall for everyone to see. She didn't do it for pride. She did it for truth. Because people needed to remember that strength doesn't always look like what they expect. The picture became a symbol. Visitors touched the frame like a relic. Some whispered prayers beneath it. Others cried without knowing why. But for Marcia, the photo was a reminder of something deeper. That justice, real justice, is never instant. It's fought for quietly, endlessly, often alone. It's not just in the handcuffs or the headlines. It's in the choice to stand, again and again, even when no one claps for you. And though she'd brought down a network of hate, she knew that victory was temporary. Because hate adapts. It hides in new faces, new uniforms, new hashtags. It mutates into laws, policies, systems that look polished, but still bleed the same poison underneath. Sometimes, late at night, she'd watch the empty booths and wonder how many other people, in other towns, were living the same story. Facing the same cruelty, the same disbelief, the same lonely courage. She thought about the young waitress in another diner who might one day face her own gang of cowards. Would she be ready? Would she know what to do? Would she even survive it? The thought haunted her. But it also gave her purpose. Marcia began writing letters to young women, to students, to small-town leaders, to anyone who needed a reminder that silence is never safety. She wrote in longhand with calm precision, just like she poured her coffee. The words weren't poetic, but they were powerful. When they try to make you small, remember, they fear what you carry. The world doesn't change when you fight loud. It changes when you refuse to be erased. One of those letters ended up framed in the Ridgefield Public Library, above a plaque that read, "In honor of those who stand when standing costs the most." But despite all the praise, all the attention, Marcia never felt like a hero. Heroes win. She had simply survived. And survival isn't glory, it's work. Work that never ends. Still, every morning she opened her diner the same way, before sunrise, with the smell of coffee and the sound of the jukebox hum. The difference was now, when she unlocked the door, she didn't feel invisible, and neither did the town. Neighbors started talking more openly about what they'd seen and ignored. School teachers began holding discussions about bias in history. Church leaders spoke about the courage to confront evil, not just pray it away. Ridgefield began to heal, not because hate had vanished, but because someone had finally forced it into the light. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It whispers. And sometimes it wears an apron. In the end, Marcia's story wasn't about revenge or even victory. It was about revelation, the moment when the masks fell away and everyone saw who they really were. Some saw monsters, others saw cowards, and a few saw a reflection they didn't like but couldn't deny. Years later, the diner still stood. The sign still buzzed. The walls still held the echoes of that day. Tourists stopped by, drawn by curiosity or guilt, but locals came for something else, hope. They came to sit in the booth where she once faced hate and sip coffee, under the glow of a neon light that had seen too much and kept shining. Anyway, and when newcomers asked about the story of the gang, the arrests, the woman who changed everything, the regulars would smile softly and say, "She's still here." Look around. Every person sitting in peace right now, that's her legacy. Because Marcia's fight was never about punishing the guilty. It was about teaching the living. She reminded a town, and perhaps a country, that racism doesn't always wear hoods or wave flags. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it hides behind laughter or silence, or the phrase, "I didn't mean it like that." But always it survives on one thing: complicity. And so her story became more than a headline. It became a mirror, held up to every viewer, every listener, every bystander who ever looked away and thought, "It's not my problem," because it is. Every act of silence is a seed. Every look away grows roots, and every "not my problem" eventually blooms into someone else's tragedy. Marcia didn't ask the world to thank her. She asked it to wake up, and as her diner light flickered against the dark highway each night, it became a beacon for those still trapped in their own quiet battles, a symbol of defiance, of dignity, of the truth that light doesn't ask permission to shine in the dark. So when people tell her, "You changed everything," she simply shakes her head. "No," she says softly. "The truth did. I just stopped hiding it. And maybe that's the lesson, that in a world still struggling to confront its own reflection, the smallest act of courage, one woman refusing to bow her head, can expose the rot that whole systems tried to bury. That the strongest weapon against hate isn't rage, but resilience. That justice begins, not in courtrooms or protests, but in ordinary places, diners, sidewalks, neighborhoods, and where someone finally says, "Enough." And so her story ends not with applause, but with a question that lingers in the silence between heartbeats, echoing across screens, homes, and generations. When hate comes to your door, will you pretend not to see, or will you be the one who stands?